So we're all sitting at home because of the coronavirus, which gives me an opportunity to look at some of the forgotten treasures of my ever-growing library. And you know, I've moved several times. We moved from, well, when I was in London, we moved a couple of times, and then we moved from London to Los Angeles. We moved a couple of times in Los Angeles. Here I am in Beverly Hills. This is my home. Behind me is a very small part of my library. Most of my library is in fact kept in storage in boxes, and over the years I've put stuff in boxes which I haven't looked at for a very long time, and I decided, both in terms of keeping myself occupied and perhaps some viewers out there occupied, I'm going to go through some of those boxes and share some of those treasures with you and their background. So I've just taken a random box off a shelf in storage, and I'm now going to look through some of those items. So here, we'll start with this piece here. Tshuvas Gedolei Yisrael, the Rosh Memsheles Yisrael, B'She'elas Mihu Yehudi. Here we go, you can perhaps see that. So when I found this pamphlet some years ago, it was published in 1959. It was actually falling to pieces. I've had the entire thing here was redone. You know, they have this way of reclaiming paper which is acidic and falling to pieces. So I had this redone when I was living in London. What's so interesting about it is, well, first let me tell you what it is. It was put together by an organization called the Organization of Religious Zionists in America, essentially Mizrahi. In New York, 1959, it's a very, very unusual pamphlet. So the concept of Mihu Yehudi was very controversial during the first years of the State of Israel, because there was this concept that if anybody would have been murdered by Hitler during the Holocaust, they should be allowed entry and citizenship in Eretz Yisrael, Medinat Yisrael. The problem with that is, of course, that Hitler was willing, and the Nazi Holocaust machine was willing to kill anybody whose grandparent was Jewish, which means that you didn't need to be Jewish. You could be a Christian, a fully practicing Christian. You had one grandparent who was Jewish, that was sufficient for you to be murdered in Auschwitz. That being the case, there was a great protest that went up among the rabbis of the world, saying that you are creating, the State of Israel is creating a new definition of Judaism, because you are deciding that somebody can be Jewish based on what that Nazi murderer Hitler decided was Jewish, where in fact we have thousands of years of tradition as to what it means to be a Jew. Either you are born Jewish because your mother was Jewish, or you convert through a reputable conversion authority and you become Jewish that way. Simply to allow people to take citizenship in Eretz Yisrael, Medinat Yisrael, as Jews because Hitler would have murdered them seems to be a ridiculous definition to use. In any event, this organization is Stadrut HaTzioniyim HaDatiyim B'America, Mizrahi HaPoel HaMizrahi, published a pamphlet which contained a series of letters that they had put together as Zionists, as supporters of the State of Israel, to the Rosh HaMemshalah in 1959. I have a feeling it was Ben Gurion, and it's extremely unusual because it contains letters from people that you wouldn't regularly associate with religious Zionism. So the first letter is from Chaim Heller, who was one of the teachers of Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, who did associate with the Mizrahi. Rabbi Chaim Heller lived after the Second World War in Manhattan. He was associated with Rabbi Yoshe Ber, as he's known, J.B. Soloveitchik, in Berlin. An absolute genius. I have some of his svarim, perhaps we'll come across them in one of the boxes. That doesn't seem to be too odd, and it's co-signed between Rabbi Chaim Heller and Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik, who was at that time living in Boston. He lived in Boston throughout the period of his life that he lived in the United States, and he would commute to New York, where he taught the senior Talmud Shir at Yeshiva University. Another letter here is Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog. At that time, he was the chief rabbi of Israel. In fact, he'd recently passed away. He died in 1959. So far, so good. Then we have a letter from someone who we would not regularly associate with the Mizrahi of America, and that is the Ponevezher. The Ponevezher is signed on a letter here. He was the Rosh Hashiva of Ponevezh before the Second World War, and after the war, or during the Second World War, he arrived in Eretz Yisrael and he built Yeshiva Ponevezh in Bnei Brak. On the same page as the Ponevezher's letter regarding Mihu Yehudi, opposing this idea that we should identify Jews by the way they were going to be defined by Hitler, on the very same page is Shai Agnon. Shai Agnon was the very famous literary Israeli who won the Nobel Prize for Literature. The next page, don't forget, this is a pamphlet issued by the Religious Zionists of America. Hagon Reb Aaron Kotler of Lakewood Yeshiva. So we have here, in the same pamphlet, a letter from Reb Aaron Kotler, Shai Agnon, the Ponevezher, Reb Yitzhak Isaac Herzog, Chief Rabbi of Israel, Reb Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik and Reb Chaim Heller, and the final and most vehement letter, in fact it's two letters, joined together, is from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who of course knew Rabbi Soloveitchik in Berlin. But it's so unusual to find all of these names, these rabbinic luminaries, co-signed on one issue, in one pamphlet, in one publication, that I decided to rescue this pamphlet from the Seamus box where I found it and had it redone so that I could enjoy it and read it through in the years ahead. What's next here? Oh, very, very interesting. This is extremely interesting. This is a publication that came out in 1943. It's called Tefillah, Special Prayers to be Recited in the Present Wartime for Victory. And it's in both English, on one side it's in English, the other side it's there's some in Yiddish, there's a letter in Yiddish, and then there's a bunch of tefillahs, a bunch of prayers in Hebrew. And it was a pamphlet. I don't know who paid for the publication because we don't have any record of who paid for it. But in any event, the person who published it was a man, a very interesting man, called Rabbi Yaakov Halberstam. Rabbi Yaakov Halberstam was a descendant of the Sanzerov, Reb Chaim Halberstam, great-grandson, I believe, and he was known as the Chakava Rebbe. His father-in-law was the Shotzer Rebbe of London, and he moved to Eretz Yisrael, but at some point he came to raise money in America, and he got stuck there during the Second World War. And unfortunately, even after the war, he went back to Eretz Yisrael. Somehow it didn't work out. He came back to America, where he passed away in 1968. It's an extremely unusual piece, and I believe it's quite rare. I see here I've cut out of some in 2008 in a Kestenbaum auction. They sold this. The Chakava Rebbe of New York. He lived in the Lower East Side, and this prayer was to be said by the fighting American Jewish soldier or his relatives, and also included is a prayer for the welfare of the President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So I don't know exactly how much it sold for. It's a rare piece and very interesting piece of history. The Shotzer Rebbe's son-in-law, a descendant of Reb Chaim of Sanz, writing a tefillah for the soldiers fighting in the Second World War for their success. Oh, this is extremely interesting. I haven't seen this for years. Let's have a look here. This is a pair of books about a dispute that took place in 1932. Tshuvos u'psak din al dvar hasichsuch shel beis hakneses bein hagaboim v'roshei hakehila. So far it could be any community all over the world. It's responsa and a ruling with regard to the disagreement in the shul between the gaboim, the executive board, and the heads of the community. We haven't yet said which community, it could be any community, but this particular one is the Machzikei Hadas of Antwerp. Now, what's interesting about this is it's extremely rare to find books in Hebrew published in Antwerp. I can't tell you for sure that it was published in Antwerp, Although it does say here, if I recall, that the printer is the establishment of Del Place, Koch and Company, Anvers, which is Antwerp. Now, the Machzikei Hadas was the Frum community in Antwerp. It was the Orthodox community, and the rabbi was an extremely interesting man. His name was Reb Mordechai Marcus Rottenberg. The English name was Marcus. He was born in 1872 in Galicia, which is today Poland. It was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was actually murdered in Auschwitz in 1944. He came to Antwerp in 1912. Now, what's interesting about him is, there's two things I want to say about Rabbi Rottenberg. The first is that he was the rabbi between 1912 and 1944. When he was taken away, he was deported and murdered in Auschwitz. He had a son who should have taken over, who survived the war. His name was Reb Chaim Yaakov Rottenberg. But after the war, the community in Antwerp, for whatever reason, decided that he shouldn't fill his father's shoes, he shouldn't replace his father, and the argument went on for years and years and years. They could not find anybody to replace Rabbi Mordechai Rottenberg. However, they didn't want to keep his son. His son was, by default, was the acting rabbi of Antwerp, of the Machzikei Hadas community in Antwerp. In the mid-1950s, I think around 1956, 1957, they decided to choose a rabbi who was a rising star of the rabbinate in America. He was a Maggid Shir in Skokie, near Chicago, and his name was Rabbi Chaim Kreiswirth. Rabbi Chaim Kreiswirth was brought. He was an absolutely extraordinary Talmud scholar. He knew I know that, by the way, because I studied in Merkaz HaTorah Yeshiva in Jerusalem, where he was the Rosh Yeshiva. He would come once or twice a year, spend a week or two, and I had the honor and the privilege during a couple of those visits to take care of him personally, because I spoke Yiddish. Most of the boys in the yeshiva did not speak Yiddish, and he was much more fluent in Yiddish than he was in English. He knew the entire Talmud by heart. He was a student of Chachmei Lublin Yeshiva, where he studied in his teens. Now, I have to tell you, the entrance exam, in order to get into Lublin Yeshiva in Chachmei Lublin, you had to know 200 pages of the Talmud by heart. That means they could test you in any one of those 200 pages, and you had to know them perfectly, backwards and forwards, Rashi and Tosfos. He was a genius. He could get up, give 20-minute speech, a 40-minute speech, and he would be able to quote verbatim pieces of Talmud without looking at the text inside, from across the entire Talmud. A remarkable man. I'll tell you one funny story about him. When he was speaking once at an Aguda convention many, many years ago, probably 30 years ago, he was the guest speaker at the keynote event. And he went on and on and on as he could. He was a phenomenal speaker, real orator and a raconteur, very funny. And he spoke, and at some point they obviously decided that he was going over his allotted time, so they passed him a note, and on the note it said, "Would you please stop in 5 minutes?" Anyway, they passed him the note, and he took the note and he held it in his hand, and he continued speaking for another 20 minutes, and he says, "Oh, and Rabbi Scherer has passed me a note. I've got another 5 minutes," and then he went on for another 5 minutes. I'm sure that everybody who was there enjoyed it tremendously. In any event, Rabbi Rottenberg was replaced by Rabbi Chaim Kreiswirth, although it was many years, it was more than a decade after Rabbi Rottenberg had been killed by the Nazis. And Rabbi Rottenberg's son, Reb Chaim Yaakov Rottenberg, moved to Paris, where he became the Rav of a haredi shul in the Jewish district of Paris known as Pletzel, and he died in 1990, and I believe that Reb Chaim Kreiswirth died sometime towards the end of the 1990s, if I recall correctly, 1999. And he was not replaced by his son either. He was replaced by somebody else, and that's a story perhaps for another time. But let's get back to these two books, because as I said, this book is about a fascinating dispute that took place between the Gaboim and the Rosh Kehillah in Antwerp in 1932. Anyway, they could not resolve this dispute, and they turned to a man, and this was what really interested me about the book. They turned to a man who I'd never heard of, and I knew nothing about. His name was Rabbi David Halevi Ish Horovitz. I researched him. Fascinating individual. So the Ish Horovitz family, all Horovitzes, by the way, generally speaking, are Levim. So Ish, they descended from the Shloach HaKodesh. For 130 years, the Horovitz family were the rabbis of a city in Galicia called Stanislav. And I researched this because, I'll tell you what fascinated me about this, because I knew that in London there was a man called Reb Meshulam Ashkenazi. And Rabbi Shalom Ashkenazi, I think he died in the early 1990s. He was well in his 90s by then. He was known as the Stanislav Rebbe. And we all believed that he was the Rav of Stanislav. But when I researched it, I saw that he wasn't the Rav of Stanislav. I wondered why he would call himself the Stanislav Rebbe. He was born in Stanislav, but why is he called the Stanislav Rebbe? Anyway, Reb David Halevi Ish Horovitz. You haven't heard of him. He was also one of these great scholars. He was one of these people who knew the entire Talmud by heart, whose opinion was sought on every matter, far and wide. I believe that Rabbi Rottenberg had been associated with him in his youth, and therefore sought his guidance with regard to the dispute that had taken place and was taking place in his community. Why haven't we heard of Rabbi David Halevi Ish Horovitz, one of the great rabbis of Galicia in the early part of the 20th century? Because he delivered, it says it in my notes, a significant opening address in the first General Convention of Mizrahi after the First World War. You know why? He was a religious Zionist. And in the haredi world, in the Orthodox world, those rabbis who associated with Zionism have been airbrushed from the collective memory, from the history. He participated in the Zionist Congress of 1929, and he was part of the decision to expand the Sochnut HaYehudit, the Jewish agency, and he even joined the Jewish agency. He was a very committed Zionist. Nevertheless, he was consulted in this situation, and he issued a decision. The decision is contained in these two extremely rare pamphlets. I want to tell you one story about Rabbi David Halevi Ish Horovitz. I don't have a picture of him. I'm going to come to Meshulam Ashkenazi in a minute. But there was a Kanoi, who lived in Stanislav, and there were the community there. I don't know, this is not widely known, or certainly not widely discussed. It may be more known than discussed. But the Jewish community before the Second World War was really in great decline. The Frum Jewish community was assimilating at a rapid rate. And there was certainly behavior that was unbecoming of Orthodox Jews that was going on even in the very frummest communities. People who were going, as we say today, OTD, off the derech. And there was a zealot, a kanoi, living in Stanislav. And his name was Moshe Bergman. And he was a very, very devout chassid. He decided that what they should do is that they should have somebody stand outside the mikveh on a regular basis to see which women are attending the mikveh, and keep a list of all the women who are attending the mikveh and publicize the names of those who do and perhaps those who don't. Somehow act like a mikveh policeman to ensure that people attend the mikveh, or at least know that their mikveh attendance is being monitored. Anyway, he eventually ended up in front of Reb David Halevi Ish Horovitz, who was the rabbi of the town, and he put forward this suggestion and very vigorously argued that this was an extremely important thing to do for the future of our community. We must make sure that everybody goes to mikveh, and we've got to count each and every person who goes to the mikveh, make sure their names are recorded. David listened patiently and quietly. He went over to the shelf, the bookshelf, and he took out a chumash Bamidbar, and he read a pasuk from Parshas Balak. Mi mona afar Yaakov umispar es roiva Yisrael. It says, the pasuk says in the Torah, quoting directly from the Torah, who can count the dust of Jacob and enumerate the seed of Israel? It's a pasuk in the Torah. He says, well, what is this pasuk talking about? So Rashi says, counting is Ravi Oisehen. counting the procreation of Israel, the times that people, the Jewish people, each and every time that they come together in union as part of their marriage. He said, you know who said this? Bilam. The evil prophet Bilam HaRasha was the one who suggested, Mimona Afa Yaakov Mispa Israel Yisrael. He said, Reb Moshe, do you want to be like Bilam? I wouldn't want you to be like Bilam. I definitely don't want to be like Bilam. Therefore, I don't think it's a good idea to count everybody who comes to the mikveh. And with that, the case was closed. So, let's see what I have here about Reb Moshe Ashkenazi. I certainly want to mention him. He was a very, very nice man. I have a picture of him here. Here you go. Here's a picture of Moshe Ashkenazi, Reb Moshe the Stanislav Rebbe. So I said to you, I didn't know exactly what he had to do with Stanislav, but I discovered, what was his name? I told you, his name was Reb Moshe Ashkenazi. His name actually was Moshe Yesocha Ashkenazi. His grandfather was a man called, his great-grandfather was a man called Reb Moshe Yesocha Halevi Ish Horovitz. That was Reb David Halevi's grandfather. So Reb Moshe Ashkenazi was descended from this rabbinic family. He was one of the last people left in that family after the Holocaust. And therefore, when he came to England, having been born in Stanislav and being descended from this great dynasty and bearing the name of one of the great rabbis of Stanislav, decided to retain that name within his family, and he called himself the Stanislav Rebbe. And in fact, that's how he was known. And when he died, he left a tzavah that his son, Rabbi Ashkenazi, should also be called the Stanislav Rebbe. And Rabbi Ashkenazi, who I know very well, haven't seen him for many years, continues to be called the Stanislav Rebbe. I've davened in the shtibel in Stamford Hill, and he's a man who's very close to my heart because I have 4 boys, and he did the bris milah of 3 of them. He is somebody who's done many, many thousands of circumcisions, of bris milahs in London and across the world. He's one of the best known moelim in London and a very, very wonderful man. Let's see what else I have here. All right. We'll have to leave something for next time. Well, this is fascinating. Okay, so I'm once in a second-hand bookstore, and I pick up a book. You know, in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, what they used to do is they used to publish pamphlets, paper pamphlets, and they're hard to keep together, because a pamphlet is something that you just don't treat with the same respect as a book. So people who obtained pamphlets would very often bind them in one binding. So you have various pamphlets, sometimes from multiple authors, sometimes from one author, that you put together into one binding. So I picked up this book in a second-hand book. I think it was Biegeleisen. And I was very sad to hear today that Reb Shlomo Biegeleisen was nifter, the older Biegeleisen brother who runs the Biegeleisen store in Borough Park. I've spent so many hours in that store. A very, very special man. Zecher Tzadik Librocha, and so sad to hear of his patira. In any event, I think I bought this there. Mashiach geht, Mashiach kommt. Harav Rabbi Elio Mordche Maza. That's the first one. Mashiach goes and Mashiach comes. That's the first pamphlet. Second pamphlet, let's have a look. Chemdas Re'eim. Also, Rabbi Elio Mordche HaKohen. Why is it called Re'eim? Reb Elio Mordche. So he calls his Svarim Re'eim. A Sefer was lernt sehr viel, und Avodas Hashem Yisborach geschrieben a reiner Stil, wie zu gehen dem richtigen Weg, wie zu leben, wie zu sein glücklich alle Tag. Not only was he a great rabbi, he was also a great poet. This pamphlet is in Yiddish. The next one, whole bunch of pamphlets here. Hold on. Koil Mavasa. A wichtige Sefer, was lernt de Volk Yisrael, dem Derech HaTshiva, mit soll wert sein die Geila. Rabbi Elio Mordche HaKohen Maza. HaKohen Maza. So now suddenly, when I see that, alarm bells start ringing. Who was HaKohen Maza? HaKohen Maza was none other than the chief rabbi of Moscow, who was one of the main defenders at the trial of Mendel Bayless. This, as it turned out, was his nephew. Rabbi Mordechai was his nephew. Here's another pamphlet. Nidda Chala Hadlukas Haner. A heilige en wichtige Sefer, welche behandelt alle dienen nötige für Nidda Chala Hadlukas Haner. Jedem ist das haben bei sich in Haus. Rabbi Mordechai Maza. This is for ladies, written in Yiddish. We have another one here. Mar Pelonefesh. The Sefer bringt er 4 Vater Neshama. Euch helft gewinnen de Melchuma. Heilt his Geisten von alle Leiden. Und führt ihm in Weg zu leben im Frieden. Told you he was a poet. Anyway, I have another one here, so I picked it up later. Sifsei Re'ein. Chidushim u'biurim al-sugyus kasher avona asher bi'artim v'chidashtim be'ezras ha'chayin le'odom do'as u'melamed le'enosh bina. V'akave le'boyrei nips v'soyim ki advorim shenispar b'seif hazeh b'svar yishara ba'avona amuka yimtzi chen bein le'mlei ha'toira v'yirei Hashem asher chiba ani lahem v'yefutzim ayonaisai ha'chutza v'hei rava she'eya min ha'mezakim es ha'rabim v'yehei chelki imohem v'chol ha'hoige b'seif hazeh yisborach v'chol tuv mishmei ma'al me'es ha'boyrei yisborach. What is this? It's a book of different divrei Torah. Fascinating book of all the different things that he wrote, different divrei Torah. This one is written in Hebrew. In any event, what's interesting about this book is not, he was just one of many, many rabbis, Eastern European rabbis, who ended up in the United States of America in the early part of the 20th century, and who published books in the vain hope that somebody would take notice of them, and that they could perhaps make a living, because hopefully by selling a few pamphlets they would earn a few pennies or a few dollars and they could pay for their meager way. But this man, Rabbi Maza, wasn't just an ordinary rabbi. His son also trained to be a rabbi, but ended up being one of the most famous comedians in America, Jackie Mason. So Jackie Mason is Jackie HaKohen Maza, whose father, Rabbi Mordechai, in fact, in that sefer I just showed you, Sifsei Re'ein, contains his bar mitzvah pshetel, his pilpul that he said at his bar mitzvah. I once met Jackie Mason. Here's a picture of him with Joan Rivers. Jackie Mason, I met him once and I showed him these Sforim. I said, "Can you read them?" He said, "No, but there are people who can." I said, "Do you have them?" He said, "No, but there are people who do." In any event, this was an event where there were many non-Jews. So I said to him, "I think we can grab together a few Jews here and perhaps we can daven Mariv. Have you daven Mariv?" He said, "Sure, but not lately." Jackie Mason's father was a rabbi who was capable of writing Sforim, and if you go into a second-hand bookstore selling second-hand Sforim here in the United States of America, you may find books with the word Re'eim in their title, either in Yiddish or in Hebrew. Buy them, because they are by none other than Jackie Mason's father. We're going to leave it here for today's little video. We're going to continue looking at this box and many other boxes, hopefully over the next few days and weeks, as we are all going to be caught up here at home as we are in self-quarantine, trying to avoid the coronavirus, and hopefully I'll be able to educate you about some forgotten aspects of Jewish history through some forgotten items of my library. Thank you.